Hey guys, it's a Mountain Ripper coming back to you with another video. This is going to continuation from the last video, how to photograph in manual mode. So I wanted to expand on it a little bit. Hopefully you set up your camera and did some test shots, doing some brackets with this, based on this board that I showed you and the other board. So today I'm going to go over some of these three items in a little more detail. I guess we'll start off with the ISO. With your ISO, I would try and keep it as low as you can. Like I said before, the higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is going to be. So if you get out, say you're doing some nighttime photography, or it's really dark, maybe it's the sun's already set and it's getting dark, that's when you're going to want to put your ISO up to maybe over 800, 1200, 1600. With the newer cameras you can get away with going higher than the older ones. So even if you got up to like 3200, you're probably still fine with some of these cameras. But I just want to emphasize trying to keep that ISO as low as you can, because you will get a cleaner looking, sharper looking image in the end when you upload your image. Especially if you're making enlargements, if you're going to be making big prints, keeping that lower ISO is really going to help your images. And so we'll go ahead and head on to the next step, and we're talking about shutter speeds. When you're with shutter speeds, you're going to want to be, the advantage of having the choice when you're in manual mode of using different shutter speeds is that you can get different effects in your images. Okay, for example, if you're at a racetrack and there's a race car going by and you want to get sharp pictures of the race car, but you want your background to be blurry as you're panning with the race car, what you could do is put your shutter to like 2/50th of a second, maybe 1/25th, and when the race car comes by, you're panning. So that longer shutter is blurring while the camera's moving. But the camera is moving with the car, so the car will be sharp, if that makes any sense. Or just say a horse, like you're photographing a horse and it's running on the beach. Well, you want the waves and everything in the background to be blurry, showing motion, maybe even having the legs of the horse with a little bit of blur, showing that it's running. Well, that's when you can use your shutter speed at different settings so you can show that representation that you're thinking about. So if the horse is running and you want to get a little blur in the legs, let's say, you're not going to want to be at 5,000ths of a second, because what's going to happen, everything's going to be tack sharp. The legs will be in the air tack sharp. But if you're at like maybe a 200th or a 1/25th, somewhere in that range, you can get a little bit of blur on the feet, but the rest of the horse might be sharp. It's just a matter of adjusting your shutter speed on that. And on the other end of the spectrum, let's say you're backpacking and you're in the woods and you've got your camera set up and there's a beautiful waterfall coming towards you, a river going by, and you want to show some different effects of the water. Well, generally speaking, if you're in the woods, for one thing, you really need a tripod if you're in the woods, because all the trees and all the foliage knock down the sunlight. In a lot of circumstances, you can't even get a good picture without your tripod, because your shutter speed will probably be down 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, because like I said before, you're going to want to have your low ISO, and having that lower ISO means you're going to have a longer shutter speed. So hence the need for a tripod or a way of keeping your camera still. But if you're taking your picture and you've got beautiful ferns and you've got a nice waterfall and the water's flowing by, and if you take a picture really fast and everything is sharp with the water and the waterfall, it's not going to have as nice of effect as if you drag the shutter, they call it. So meaning the shutter is open while there's movement, and that movement will show up on your sensor because your sensor is open, your camera is open, your camera's not moving, but the water is moving, so you're going to get that blur on your shutter in your picture of the water flowing by, and that makes a real nice effect if you're photographing water or photographing in nature. That is another example of using your shutter speed to give you something that you're thinking about in your mind when you're taking your picture. And there's lots of other reasons to have use a different shutter speed as well. If you're in the woods and it is dark and you've got your tripod out and you need to do a longer exposure, that you'll have your tripod. But if you want to be at say f/22, because you're going to want to have a lot of depth of field. Depth of field I'm going to get to in just a minute. But you want to have a lot of depth of field, meaning you want to have objects that are close to the camera in focus and objects that are far away from the camera in focus. Then you're going to need to stop down your lens to somewhere between 16 and 32 to get that depth of field that you need so you can have everything in your image acceptably sharp. So under any circumstance, pretty much, even during the day, you're going to need a tripod for that to keep your camera still. So that's another example of shutter speed, using your shutter speed to get the effect you want using your depth of field, because your aperture and your shutter speed are intertwined, and you're going to use the two of them together to get what you want. The ISO is something that you can change as you need to according to the light and your needs. Like if you're in the woods and you can do a long shutter speed and you are on a tripod, that's a great example of being able to lower that shutter speed down to like 100 or 200 so you can really maximize your image. On the other end of the coin, I mean, if there's some wildlife and you're photographing some wildlife and the wildlife is moving and you've got to have that faster shutter speed and the lower light, that's when you can put your ISO up. I mean, sometimes you might even have to put your ISO up to 3200 so you can get that image of that animal that as it's moving, because that's the important part of your picture. That's what you got to think about. What is the important part of your picture? I mean, what is your focal point of that picture? Is it the animal? Is it the background? Is it the waterfall? Those are the things you can think about when you're selecting your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed. So if it's an animal in the woods and it's evening, it's getting dark, sure, you're going to have to put your ISO up to 1600 or above, 3200, and you'll have to have your f-stop wide open, like f2.8, f4, or 5.6, as bright as you can get that opening for your lens. And those are the things you're going to want to do in low light. And if it's bright outside and the sun's out and you have all the lights you could need, then that will give you more flexibility with your shutter speed as well and your ISO. But general rule, keep your ISO as low as you can and think about those settings for what the photography is that you're doing or what you're trying to capture in your image. I mean, if you're trying to catch fish jumping out of the water, you're going to need a fast shutter speed. If you're photographing a football game at night and it's dark and all you have is stadium lights, you're going to need to get a shutter speed that's probably at least 5/100th of a second, so your football players won't be blurry. And that will require you to put your ISO up higher so you can get those shutter speeds that you want. So let me show you a couple things here with this camera and with these lenses to show you how and the effect of what happens when you're using your depth of field. Okay, depth of field, as I spoke to you before, is going to be controlled by your aperture and your lens. And a lot of the newer lenses, like this lens here, this is a nice lens. It's a Nikon 70-300. It's a 4.5 to 5.6. So it's not going to open up as much and be as bright as this lens, which is a 2.8. Okay, so seeing that right there, that little opening, if I open the lens up, let's see, undo the lock switch. When I open up the lens here, you can see how the lens opening gets bigger. See that? That's 22. See how much, that's 2.8. See how much light's coming through? And then we go down 16 and a half, 16, 11 and a half, 11, and so on, all the way down. Actually, that's 2.8. That's wide open right there. And we just click down stops. That is the stops as it goes through. That's going to give you the most depth of field, but it's also going to give you the longest exposure, f22. Okay, and that's going to give you the fastest exposure, which is f2.8, but it will give you the least amount of depth of field. Okay, so let's talk about depth of field. All right, so hopefully that little demonstration that I just showed you with the lenses will give you an idea. When the aperture is big, there's more light hitting the sensor, but you have less depth of field. When the aperture is small, you have much less light falling on the sensor, but you have more depth of field. And like this lens right here, this is a 70 to 300 millimeter lens. So right here it's 70 millimeters from here to the focal plane. And if you go to here, it's 300 millimeters to the focal plane. And the more focal length you have, it's an inherent property of these lenses is that the longer the focal length is of your camera, the less depth of field you're going to get. For example, if you are at 300 millimeters at f16, your image will be sharper depth of field wise, but it's not going to have as much depth of field as if it's at 70 millimeters. So as a rule of thumb, the wider the focal length, the more depth of field you get given that specific f-stop. So if it's f16, you're going to get a lot more depth of field out of a 24 millimeter lens than you're going to get out of a 300 millimeter lens. So that is why you've got to check your depth of field real close when you're taking pictures, when you're stopping down with a long lens. With a long lens, the longer the lens is, the more careful you've got to be with your focus, and the more careful you've got to be with your lens movement, meaning steadiness, and the more careful you've got to be with your depth of field. So a place to start would be working around the middle range with your depth of field and playing around with that, and you can look real close to the background and the foreground. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is controlled by your aperture, okay? And the smaller your aperture, remember the fraction, so if it's 1/22 of the focal length, that's going to be the smallest, probably the smallest aperture you can get with your lens. And that's going to give you the most depth of field. So a lens itself only focuses in one spot, which is wherever you focus within your image. If you focus on the car, or the mountain in the background, or the flower right in front of you, wherever you focus your camera, that is what's going to be in focus. So if you go from f2.8 to f22 and you're changing your f-stop, the amount of depth of field that you get will give you more area that is acceptably in focus. Okay? So if you're at f22 and the flower in front of you looks sharp and the mountain in the background looks sharp, then that's great. But just remember that the one part that you are focusing on is what's going to be actual sharpness. So the rule of thumb is if you do want to have something that is in sharp focus from close up to far away, then you want to focus your camera 1/3 the way into the picture. The way that lenses work is you're going to get more depth of field behind where you focus rather than in front of where you focus. So you're going to want to focus 1/3 into the image. And so if you've got a car that you want to have in focus, but you also want everything else in the picture, but the car is, say, halfway into the picture, you might not want to focus on the car. You're probably going to want to focus on the curb or the bushes or something like that 1/3 into the picture before the car. So when you take your picture, you'll have everything in focus at f/22 or f/32 or f/16. But if you specifically want to have the background out of focus and the foreground out of focus, then you open up your f-stop so you're allowing more light into the sensor, but you're also getting less depth of field. So if you're at f2.8 or f4 or f5.6, you're going to have less distance that is acceptably in focus than if you were at f16 or f22. And that's how you use your f-stops to control your depth of field. So a lot of landscape photographers, say like where I was talking before about going to the woods and taking pictures in the woods, you're going to want to have all or the majority of your image in sharp focus, unless you're doing some macro photography, or if you're doing something that's where you're being selective with your focus, selective focus. But if you want everything in focus, you're going to want to be at f22, f16, f32, and you're going to have your longer shutter speed because you got that smaller aperture and you want to have everything in focus. So that's the reason for having different f-stops and your needs for different f-stops. And like I said before, the more focal length you have, the less depth of field you're going to have. So like if you have a 12 millimeter fisheye lens, it's going to be basically everything's going to be sharp without even focusing, because your angle of view is so wide that everything is going to be in focus. But if you have a really long lens, like say if you're 400 millimeters, you're never probably going to be able to get everything in focus. You're going to be using selective focus to get the image that you want. That's why, like when you see like sports pictures and stuff with a football player, the crowd's out of focus because you just don't have that much depth of field at f2.8. If I was at f2.8, you could actually focus on my eyes and the tip of my nose would be out of focus. That's depth of field of like that much wide open at 2.8. But as you go to f4, it's going to get that much depth of field. 5.6, that much depth of field. f8, that much. 16, 11, 16, 22, 32. So the more depth, the more you stop down your lens, the more depth of field you're going to get. So that's the best way that I can explain it. And so you can use those settings to apply that to what you're trying to get in your images. So if you have any questions, please ask, and I'll get back to you as quick as I can. And I really appreciate you watching, and thanks a lot.